Welcome to another episode of New Wine Uncorked. And as always, we are stoked that you're here joining us this morning, Friday. And we're live on YouTube. For those of you that are joining us, you saw maybe the announcement on Twitter. You can also follow New Wine on Twitter, so you can share that with your friends. And so New Wine is available online, social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and obviously YouTube. And on YouTube, we have this thing going, New Wine Uncorked, where Phil, Tony, and I continue to get together and to dialogue, because dialogue is the dynamic essence of the Christian faith that so often is missing when we talk about stepping into culture, stepping into the realm that's right in front of us. And New Wine Uncorked is part of New Wineskins, which is the Institute for Cultural Engagement through Christ, in Christ and through the Spirit. And so we continue to seek ways to dialogue about this, because in the Christian culture, there's a call to step in with word. You have truth, but also deed, and that's to play out in deed. And so today we're continuing this discussion that we've had going for months now on the church, the Christian church, and her role or her engagement of culture. And last week, we were talking about this, the bifurcation of the human, and we talked about sacred and secular. And well, what does that mean? Is there a sense of actually secularizing the human? Like, can there be a secular human? And this goes back a couple of weeks ago, where we were actually going back and forth on the language of cancel culture and whether or not it's pejorative, positive, and the like, both and. So we're continuing that. This week, the title that we've given to this episode is Into the Margins. Last week, Phil brought up this idea of going into the margins, this truth of Christians in the realm of engagement. And Phil brought up some of the stuff that he does, his work throughout the week with the Portland Rescue Mission. And when we are in the margins, though, are we doing what Jesus calls us, followers of Christ, to do, to be word and deed? But what word, what deed, and what is this called to? So stepping into the margins, when the Christian church steps into the margins, steps into the realm of society, is the church creating space, or is it creating more and more chaos? So today's call for the church to be involved, and we're on the heels of summer, and we look back at last summer and the summers before, we have to question, okay, what kind of summer is this going to be for the church? Is it going to be a summer, ridden with protest within even the church itself, as opposed to the church protesting some of the injustices? Or is it going to be a summer of unity? And we've been talking about this. Well, what is unity for the church? So as we step into this, Phil, you mentioned about this idea of going into the margins. And Tony, we've talked about this with societies, with the church engaging. So when people hear this, stepping into the margins, they hear this, books have been written on this, Jesus in the margins, Jesus going, Jesus in the ghetto, these paintings. What should we be thinking about that when we talk about we, meaning Christians, and as leaders of the church, you both have leadership roles within the church, and so do I as well, but also in our roles within the education system. We all do teaching and advanced degrees. And so we have to be mindful of this. When we talk about the church going into the margins, what should be on the mindset of Christians and also society? What should society expect when the church says we're going to the margins?
Yeah, starting with the church perspective, I think one thing that we should be prepared for is the idea that our church is going to get more messy. Now, I want to say more messy in the sense of not just that the church has mess as it stands. I mean, we try to present a kind of a what's the word? A church that's sanitized, a church that's clean. Everything's going good here. And I want to say we try to present. I think a common perspective of how we try to present the church is that everyone's good here. We come to church, we come together to worship and sing for a little bit, and to hear a nice word for a little bit, and then we go home. And sometimes we disregard the fact that there's mess in our lives. But then when we invite folks that we aren't accustomed to seeing in our church into the building, and or we go out as a church to be amongst people, to serve and to be with people. Yeah, we're inviting more mess, we're inviting more complexity, we're inviting different conversations, different attitudes, different culture, that kind of stuff into the church, and things can simply get messy. And it can be scary, it can be nerve-wracking, it can be one of those things that makes it so you're not fit to be a leader in a church, because you're wanting to be more a part of the mess, or you want to help redeem the mess, and or you want to talk about the mess, and it may not make your church as safe of a place anymore. And that can be a nerve-wracking and scary thing for any church leader in any spec. But same token, when from the world's perspective, I think it's a statement. The church doing this is a statement to the world that the church is here and the church cares. And Jesus, it's not even a statement that Jesus is here, but it's a statement that the people of God is here. And we're doing something about what's going on in the world, that we care, that we have a concern, that we have thoughts about these things. And we're not just in our cloistered, in our little place, talking about just regressions and moving back and holding back culture, but it's a statement that we're here. So that's where I start out with.
I'll probably answer this indirectly, but that's nothing new. With with a conversation that I've been having with some friends who are also in ministry in the Beaverton, Portland area, is that for sure there's nothing that seems to make Christians distinctive from other religions or even the quote unquote world if we're so concerned with our behavior. Like, our behavior is important, our ethics, our morality is important, but what makes Christianity distinctive is like, well, I believe what makes us distinctive is that God has done something, God is doing something, God will do something. What's distinctive for Christianity is whatever Christians do or ought to do, it is in response and is in its predisposition, it is a response to what God is doing and has already done and will do. Our distinction is not that we're not the primary actor in our actions. But for some reason, it seems like with Western Christians, we always want to get a leg up in the game. We always want to win whatever it is we want to win. And so the questions of marginalization for the church, while are pertinent, I wonder if it still is too centered on us, and we're not centered on God enough, because we're so concerned about what the world will do to us, quote unquote, the world. So I have maybe an allergy to a fear of marginalization, at least in the West.
Yeah. So do you, and this is interesting when we're talking about marginalization, it's quite interesting because a lot of the language of victimization and martyrdom from the Western church will come that the church has been marginalized, and especially when we talk about public schools and prayer and the ability to have Bible studies and things like that. I would imagine that a lot of conservative Christians, and maybe even liberal Christians, when we talk conservative, I'm talking like that political label, but bound up with their religion. I would imagine that if it's more of the Christian on the right side of the political spectrum, also with faith, that they would feel marginalized a lot of times. And we see this play out. And it's interesting when we talk about marginalization, because then it gets into some crazy situations such as January 6th. If you talk to a lot of those folks, would you not say that both sides of the spectrum feel marginalized? And this is, so when we talk, so this is the complexity of like talking about the church going into the margins. Do you think the church has the depth and the breadth to actually go into the margins of disagreement? So we talk about like into the margins. I think a lot of people think economically, like society, like, oh, that means going into the ghetto, whatever the ghetto is in people's brains, right? But what about into the margins of our ideology? These margins that continue to distinguish people based on some sort of ideal that is never even plausible, because the way in which politically we push up peace, it doesn't bring peace to anyone in our realms. Maybe brings peace to the political standards for the politicians in Washington, D.C., but they're not going into the margins. So I wonder if we stretch it even further though, and say, is the church though willing to go into the margins of its own mindset, of its heart sitting? I was reading an article today, like for some of the the Southern Baptist section of the church, in the Baptist convent, they're having some issues within their leadership, and I was just reading where one of the articles they were concerned about is, what are they going to do when Rick Warren retires? Saddleback is, and I'm like, is that the biggest issue? And yes, leadership for the church is a big deal. But what are they going to do? Would someone like Saddleback actually take a turn towards someone who's a little bit more about into the margins, both of the ideology of the church, but also into the margins of serving one another, like going into that realm of, hey, this church is going to partner with I don't know, this month on a prominent Black church because we want to highlight some of the historical truth that has been missed throughout. And June is a beautiful month to do that because of the richness of the Black community that has been absolutely, decimated and forgotten. Are there churches partnering like into that margin? But then also, are they willing to go into the other margin of celebrating this month with the LGBTQ plus community? Like, are we even challenging ourselves to go into the margins of our own ideology as well as, so when we talk about this, because I believe the marginalization is happening on both sides, but how often is the marginalization of the church by our own accord?
Yeah, just going into the depth of what do we mean to say that we love and that we love unconditionally. What do we mean? Diving into that and the two issues you bring up there, where this month celebrating Juneteenth, and then those who celebrate Pride Month this month. Like, well, okay, well, we say that we love and we invite all are welcome, come as you are, those kind of things. And what does that actually mean? How deep is that actually in our church? Someone who's LGBTQ plus come to our congregation and not just visiting church. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about someone who wants to join the church, participate in ministry, lead in worship, lead a small group. What kind of questions? And then when does the limits of our love actually are now reached where we're like, wait a second, hold on. We got to consider this, and this becomes a thing. But then also the idea of what you brought up with Rick Warren and Southern Baptist Conference, that church. I think I have to figure out, what does it mean that, we've been making moves in this direction. Now, what does it mean for the future of our church? Do we invite leaders in that are going to be leading in this way, that are going to be talking about this more succinctly, that's going to be talking about this more seriously and taking it more seriously going forward? It's the thing. And leadership structures in churches are going to handle that. They're going to figure out how to do it. And that's very often going to be, we're going to figure out someone to take the lead that doesn't do the things that we're not accustomed to. So there's going to be questions to answer. And I think it all kind of goes into how much are we wanting to be our conversation last week. How worldly are we going to be? Not worldly in the sense of sinful, but worldly in the sense of geared towards the world. How much are we going to be about people when we're looking in our church? So that'll be some of the questions to address and think about.
Yeah, I wouldn't hold to January 6th with those people who committed treason as marginalized. I would actually say that is the expression of the majority, of the white majority. That's what losing privilege looks like, when a dominant majority has gotten so used to power and privilege, begins to experience equity That's what it was. The treason that was committed on January 6th was not a marginalization. And I think it's a mischaracterization to say that it was just a few.
Hey, so Tony,
Yeah.
just to and I think I tend to agree with you, and I don't want to stir this up just because we want to compare, but could there not be folks that were part of the January 6th that were there because they did feel marginalized just as much, and they didn't know the predominant philosophy going behind it? Because I feel like to cast everyone that was part of the January 6th is to say that everyone that protested in the streets last summer is an insurrectionist as well. Like they're a protester because they were looting, there was looting going on and things like that. That wasn't part of the protesting, right? There were some people that were part of the BLM movement that I think, like, let's say there was looting in the streets, and so then everyone, the one side wants to highlight, oh, see, the protest in the street create this. The insurrection, January 6th, everyone in part of this is this. And while I agree predominantly with your assessment, do you not think, though, that there were some folks in there that legitimately believe, I'm going here because I really want to stand up for, like, I believe that this, whether or not we agree with them, but they believe that the liberal agenda is infecting and it's like morally damaging? Could they have been there on righteous, intentions in their own mind? So as to, and all I'm saying is, do we have to be careful with that too? Because whether I agree with January 6th or not, I tend to agree with your assessment that it is tough to consider that a movement of marginalization, movement of marginalized people. But could there be some white people who are part of the marginalized group, majority group, people of color, because of their ideology? Like, and so is there a complexity of that even, or is that just not?
No, I hear you on that. I think for me, I would say no, because it comes back down to, we're still trying to rehabilitate the image of white people. But when it's a Black Lives Matter protest or march, it's like, oh, that's rioting. Look at that. Like, we care more about property than we do about Black people being murdered. Like, so we keep framing the Black Lives Matter marches as these riots because property is being destroyed. But who cares if property is being destroyed when people are being murdered by the supposed law enforcement?
Yeah.
And then we look at January 6th, and it's always trying to rehabilitate, oh, these poor white people who misunderstood. And it's like, we can't cut it both ways. You can't have your cake and eat it too. Like, either white people are smart and intelligent and they have a firm grasp on reality, and if they want to make claim to being the superior race, cool. But January 6th showed that there's a significant chunk of white people and conservative leaning people who don't live in reality. Like, to whitewash it or like tone down the severity of January 6th, I think, is what we see the church doing, whether it's with January 6th or with racism or with misogyny or with the SBC and sexual abuse. Like, when Russell Moore came out with his letter, or the leaked letter, and said, there are neo-Confederates, there are slavery enthusiasts within the SBC, and then to have SBC executive committee members go, well, that's not the SBC I know. SBC, Southern Baptists would never be pro-slavery. I think that's the same thing we do with, like, January 6th. We always try to rehabilitate the majority because it's much easier to do so than to actually confront it for what it is. And like, the talk about marginalization, like, the church in the West has not been marginalized. And so, as somebody who's Vietnamese and the child of a war refugee, I've experienced marginalization. And I know that's not what the church experiences. If anything, it's easier for me to be an evangelical Christian than it is for me to be a Vietnamese male. And so the talk of marginalization and, like, oh, they're good people, in there on January 6th, working under good, righteous pretenses, we never give that type of assumption to Black Lives Matter. We never assume the best about Black Lives Matter. As the Western church, particularly evangelicals, there's always an assumption for wrong. There's always, dare I say, profiling of Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
And so I guess for me, it's hard for me to like, I know I'm coming off maybe not sounding gracious or balanced, but like it's hard when there's a continual mincing of words and like rehabilitation of white evangelicals when it's not equal or equitable for Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, let's stay camped out here for a little bit, because I will definitely say that yeah, Tony, you did not sound ungracious at all. It's ridiculous. It's really ridiculous to think that people who a group of people who took weapons during the day while a vote was going on to the state capitol, shouting that they're wanting to look for the vice president and other people to harm them, and to think that that is the same as anything else. I that's something of its own. I can't even, I don't have word I don't have good words for anything that's happening. So, yeah, but then to try to normalize and explain that, to say, well, people didn't understand. What did they not understand? We're going to a state capitol with weapons, right? Okay, we're not talking about the moms that were wearing, I don't know, Rubbermaid trash cans when they were getting tear gas shot at them last summer. That is not the same thing. All right, I'm gonna just get off of that. But the notion that that the church is marginalized has been something we've talked about within New Wine for a long time, almost that we need to protect Jesus, and that we need to protect and defend Jesus in this regard, that if we don't have our voice as loud as possible, then Jesus can't speak on his own. Like, what are we talking about? I mean, that's not the thing. Now, at the same token, do I believe that when it becomes January 6th or any response to COVID or anything like that comes out of a response of people are shutting down the gospel, people are shutting down church, they don't want the gospel to be preached, and it comes out of that people feel that? I believe people feel that. Whether or not that's connected to reality is a whole nother matter, because we can preach the gospel not using our words any time of the day. We do not need 2 hours on Sunday to do that. We do not need an organ, a piano, a keyboard, a guitar, or anything in order to do that. So there's no sense. I don't understand how people can see the church, in particular in America, to be marginalized at all, because we can always preach the gospel wherever we are. Now, that being said, yeah, I do believe that people believe that the church is being marginalized, and out of that, they're going to do ridiculous things. Okay, let me stop being ungracious. Yeah. But yes, people do believe that they need to protect the gospel, but God can defend himself. The gospel still is proclaimed. Jesus is still doing the things where the church is not. Well, we're there. People are still demonstrating Christ-like love, whether or not the church is actually present. So the church actually showing up in places where the church hasn't been, amongst people where the church are afraid to go to. Man, God has already been there. Christ has already been there, leading those people into God's love. We just have to jump in and actually point them in the direction of where he is. So yeah, and answer questions that people don't even have those questions. They're just trying to survive. And we're saying, no, God has been the one that's sustaining you this entire time. There's a whole lot of things I can say about all of this, because it just sounds crazy to think that we in America think that we're hindered at all in preaching the gospel because we can't meet for 2 hours somewhere, or we have to wear a mask when we're going somewhere to meet, or for whatever reason, then there's people that needs God's love that's in our city, and all we have to do is show it to them. And we don't need anything else to do it, just his love that we have already. So there you go.
It's quite interesting too with the talk of love. I don't know, most people within the evangelical world wouldn't even understand or wouldn't know what an encyclical is, but a letter that the Pope puts out. And I was just reading the recent letter that the Pope sent out. It wasn't an encyclica, but it was an actual letter that he sent out on June. Let me see. I actually have it in front of me. June 9th. So a couple of days ago. And it was in response to this John 17 movement. And it's a movement of love, this unity. And he sent this letter out, and he said that relational reconciliation should be the way of the Christian, relational reconciliation, right? And he said that he writes this: love has no need for profound knowledge, which is however necessary. He says love is an encounter of life, first with the Lord Jesus, with the person of Jesus, and from there on, from that encounter of love, arise friendship, brotherhood, and the certainty of being the children of the same Father. Life that is shared and dedicated to a higher purpose. Love can change the world. Do we think, though, that the church, do you think that the evangelical church would nod? Yes. Okay, cool. Love can change the world. But does the church believe that? Because I dig this discussion, because I like the fact that I want to get into these really complex things of, can there be Christians that were at both the January 6th and then also last summer in Washington, D.C. protesting both? Is there, because I do want to continue to, I think the more we step into the dialogue of, well, what does it mean to be a Christian regardless? And I know this is such a weird statement, but regardless of color, creed, nationality, all of that, what does it mean if we truly have love in the middle? Does that matter? And that doesn't mean to deny the distinctions. The fact that you are a Black man living in Portland matters, or Washington, right, Phil? And that is a distinction that distinguishes you from me, a white guy in Northern California. However, if we're going with love, while we recognize those distinctions, those aren't the defining characteristics of who we are. If love is at the center, but do we have conversations that are willing to weed into these situations where we have, like, let's say we have disagreeing views about January 6th, where I don't know, I'm not sure I'm as, and maybe this is from a white view and a person of color view, right? That you and I see January 6th as different. I'm not willing to completely write off every single person there as being an insurrectionist in there because they are anti-democracy, whatever the case might be. I believe some went there actually because they have this inside of them. They had and I'm not trying to defend January 6th by no means, because I also believe last summer, and even with the BLM protest, that there are people who are protesting from righteous. They're not trying, when they call for the defunding of the police, they're not saying, I want chaos and anarchy. I want to create space for true reconciliation, right? They're not there because I don't think any of these things last summer were about the looting and the firebombing and things like that. I think that was unfortunately, a group that was focused on by the media. Same thing with January 6th. Now, January 6th, I do believe, was much more of the aggressiveness against the system. But is there something righteous to take out of that, as well as righteous to take out of last, so we can start to truly understand the voices? Because I don't want to just, my concern is with all of these protests is that when we start bringing faith into it, we see things that are unrighteous in what we would deem as sinful, and we just say we got to just get rid of that. But when people are up and yelling and they're at arms, there's some reason why. It's not usually just destruction. And so I feel like the reason why I say the church has been marginalized, not because of society, but because we do this. We do what Kierkegaard tells us not to do, is it's an either or, kind of like what we said last week. There's this bifurcation. It's either sacred or it's secular. So we look at January 6th, we look at BLM, we look at these things, and it's got to be either this or it's that. And we don't step into the muck of, well, why are people doing that? Because, well, if it's not exactly what I want, well, then they must be wrong. And so that's all I want to, I appreciate us stretching it out. New wineskins is about stretching us out, because I need to be stretched. Because to be honest, sometimes when I hear about anything, a protest against racial things, and I hear the push against white people, I have to admit, sometimes I go, well, I'm white. And I agree with what you guys are saying, more so you, Phil, and Tony are saying, than the white evangelical. But if people look at me, they're going to put me in that camp as opposed to in a camp side by side with you. And so I when I hear some of the talk, I go, whoa, are they talking about me? And I need that tension. I want it to always be where it's uncomfortable for me, but I also want it to be where I can step up and say, hey, but so how then do we press into this to where we don't do the either or? White evangelicals are always over here. They're always this, just like what white evangelicals tend to do is they say, oh, BLM protests, oh, they're this, how do we avoid that kind of language to where we're not doing that? But we're embracing even a group that we were like, oh, because that's what I'm talking about. When I say into the margins, are we willing to go into the margins of the ideologies of the groups that we just don't understand, and because we just don't agree with them? Like, do you think the church has that capacity so as to create space within some of the most destructive and darkened areas because the ideology is so constrictive? Is there space within the church to even go in there and to create even amount of space? Or does the church so neglect that area that when we step into society, all we do is create chaos because we are the perpetuators of this bifurcating, world of in and out, black and white, yes and no, I don't know. Or am I off my rocker? And you're like, yeah, but see, because I appreciate, Tony, when you're saying, no, I don't think into the margins like this, the marginalized church, the Western church is not marginalized. I think it's important for you to challenge and say, dude, but you're seeing that because even though maybe you haven't lived what would be deemed the white privileged life, you still have white privilege because you are white. And I have to go, you're right. How can I argue against that? But then is there ability to step in and say, even white privileged folks have transformation to where they can, so where there's this reconciliation of all to where my ideology can be transformed through your ideology and vice versa, to where we're not ideological characters, that we're stepping into the margins even of our own thoughts and our hearts.
Yeah. I think I come down hard on January 6th, not because I want to dehumanize the people there, but it's because unless we call it for what it is, we can't humanize them. There can't be love if we tone down what evil is. Because we can be as hyperbolic or not hyperbolic if we want to stretch it to its furthest conclusion. Everybody always goes here, but could you imagine when the Nazi party rose up and Hitler didn't win, and then that's when they did the hubbub and then he got power again? Could you imagine we're sitting across from our Jewish brothers and sisters I know that they're coming after you, but some of them are just misguided. They want to protect German heritage, like blood and soil. Come on. It's from a good place in their heart. Or even we can go closer today with the SBC. Think of all the good that the SBC is doing. I know there's a ton of sexual abuse and kids are being molested and raped, but look at all the churches that are being planted. I know they're trying to protect the base, but look at the heritage. Look at how good the gospel's going forward. So it's not that bad. There are good people in the SBC. I think our unwillingness, yes, we should never be the arbiters of what is truth and justice. We can never decide that, because then we become blind to how we participate in evil and injustice. So we can't decide what is good and what is evil, but that doesn't mean I'd rather be wrong and have Jesus confront me for that than be silent and never be wrong. Because I just the whole silence is violence thing, whether it's violence against my brother and sisters, whether it's violence against my soul. I'm not out to dehumanize and demonize the participants of January 6th. But I think when we try, I don't think middle ground is what we're looking for. Like, we're not drawing lines in the sand to divide. We have to draw lines in the sand to realize how far apart we are so that we can cross that divide. Maybe it's not about finding common ground, but it's about going to the other side. And maybe, Matt, that's what you're talking about like going to the margins of ideologies and the like. But it's just, there's still always a prioritization of privilege, like, and that's what privilege affords, is that we're still trying to give an exit or a back door to the participants of January 6th. And it's like, they didn't know any better. They came there with good intentions. But how many Black people have been murdered? And it's like, we use the same logic for January 6th, but it's rationale for why Black people should be murdered. Like, oh, they didn't know any better? Well, they should have. They should have known better. What were you doing in that neighborhood at that time of night? You should have known better. Why did you have an air freshener on your rear view mirror? Should have known better. Oh, your tags are expired? Should have known better. You shouldn't have moved your hands so much. Hands up. Well, you're making the officer nervous. Should have known better. And it's like the very same logic we use to prioritize white people, and then we use to justify the murdering and the death of Black people. And I think that's where I get really riled up, because because the church not only perpetuates it, but it actively participates and benefits from that type of logic, because that's where the money is. That's where we get our donors. That's where we get our tithers. I shouldn't say donors, but that's where we get our financial security. And I think for me, for the Asian community, we're known for being, our stereotype is like docile. And when I look at older generations, I'm hard pressed to find Christian leaders who have spoken out. Like, there are faithful brothers and sisters and saints in the Asian American community who have spoken out, but in a large part, it's been outside of the church. And I don't want the younger generation, the Gen Zs and the younger millennials who are Asian Americans, to have to go through the same disappointment that I went through, and then also the same identity crisis. Like, to question, I remember being in high school when George Zimmerman got cleared for murdering Trayvon Martin, and my evangelical upbringing, and being white passing, everything within me was like, oh yeah, no, of course George Zimmerman is innocent. But now, a decade away from that, reflecting, wow, how wrong was I? And I was just a kid, but I didn't have anybody to provide me with a formation. The only formation I had was a white passing formation, a pursuit of privilege. That was my formation. And so I don't want to repeat the same mistakes for the younger generations. And maybe I'm coming too hard down on one side, or I'm too far on one side. And if I need to be more centrist, well, at least hopefully the next generation of leaders can be more centrist than I am. But I'm not, that's the whole that's my stew, the whole plethora of it.
Man, when I think of January 6th, oh man, there's so many thoughts coming to my mind right now, and none of them good. Because, well, first off, I fathom the notion of we have country officials of our country coming to a place to certify a vote, and you going there with a weapon. I don't have word. I don't understand that, and any miscommunication with it. And of course, yeah, right. Everyone there didn't have weapons. I get that, but I remember 4 years earlier where they were certifying election 2, and I don't remember we're talking about January 6th then either. What we did talk about with a lot of people, and most would say the majority of our country disliking the person that was voted in the office, that we had protests all over the country in separate places. Simply just demonstrating that we weren't in agreement, that these people weren't in agreement with what's about to happen over the next 4 years. And whether or not we approve or disagree with what happened over the next 4 years, I mean, they made their statement there. And so there's other ways of doing it. At the same token, when we're talking about the response to someone murdered in the street again, and then we're gathering together to say, hey, going to our justice centers, our jails, our police stations, saying, hey, look, this keeps happening, stop it. That's a much different thing. Now, mind you, of course, we have people that now the attention becomes, well, there were people there that wanted to loot, that wanted to riot or whatever. That's not what started this. People were gathering at police stations, were gathering at city centers saying, hey, this happened again, do something. Make sure this doesn't happen in our city. Those are two different approaches to doing this. Now, I guess I can't account for everyone that's there, but the reason for the protests were so very, very different. And so, and then what happened and the preparation for each, it makes it so I don't want to put them on the same plane. I don't want to say they're ever the same thing. And I understand why someone would say they're the same thing, but you're just not looking closely enough if you're saying these two things are the same thing. They're not. Because these protests that happened in response to George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, these things have happened in cities all the time because this stuff happens all the time, you know? And you know what happens when I worked in downtown Portland for multiple years. There were very often protests that happened in downtown Portland, regular occurrence. And not all of them turn violent. And so there's something to look into in that, but I wouldn't call the beginning or the calling for the protest. I would even associate that with even the violence that happens in the city in response to it. And especially in the middle of COVID that we had this last summer, everything got uber crazy.
So, well, and I
putting those in the same plane.
And you and me both, right? But I don't want to jump over to they can't be on the same plane automatically, because you and I both know, all three of us know, that there are plenty of people within the evangelical circle, though, that are continue to put them in the same plane. And if we just move on, though, doesn't it allow them to continue to monopolize the megaphone of saying they are on the same plane? Or maybe I'm
just going to say it plainly. They wrong. Look, they're wrong. I mean, Tony brought it up at the beginning where he said, look, if we don't call out wrong for what it is, we're not going to have a line. Okay. Just call out wrong for what it is. Like, okay, understood. Those who caused riots and stuff in downtown Portland, wrong as well. Yeah. But
don't you think that's the problem?
With a weapon, saying that you want to hang the vice president, yo. Okay, we got to draw a line here.
So
who was voted in? I get you. Even showing up and being loud and making a ruckus, because if you're gonna go out there, might as well make a ruckus so people know you're out there. Yeah, but don't run into a state building with a weapon saying you're gonna
and a noose and all that stuff, right? Yes, that's what. Yes, so that's what I guess that's what I'm getting at is, are we all just like, we're not idiots, right? People know what's right and what's wrong. And so I guess I'm tired of the church like trying to sugarcoat stuff where we dance around these issues. Because look, when I go out to the protest, like, there needs to be a case of saying, look, there is a distinguished difference when they allow some white teenager to run around with an AK-47 or whatever gun he had to protect the but then they don't allow protesters in the street of Washington, D.C. and they're spraying them. Like, I totally agree. There are definitely ways in which, and that's not to say that there weren't some right-minded people January 6th, but let's be realistic. Even if you didn't know what it was for, when you got there and you started seeing this stuff, we're not like, we are intelligent people where we could go, you know what, Harry, I don't think this group is here peacefully. I think they're not here to protest like our Christian values. I think this is what, and you could walk away. Same thing, let's say, for instance, in the streets of Washington, D.C., if I'm protesting the injustices and I see a group going up and smashing windows, I could be like, you know what, this is not what we're here for, right? And so I don't think that we're denying that. I think I get tired of us trying to sugarcoat it and dance around the issues. And I appreciate going, no. The reason that's wrong is, so fine, you showed up, you didn't understand what was going on January 6th, but clearly it changed to a way where there's no way a well intentioned Christian, I'm talking Christians who say that they're about this love, could have been there and not then wanted to stop it, right? I'm sorry, but that's where you have to get to a point as Christians where, isn't there a line? You're talking about that line, Tony. And I, in my classes and even when I preach, I'll use this where, and I think I probably got it from Metzger or something, but that there is a line. Jesus draws the line, and he draws it not as a straight line, but he draws it as a circle around himself and says, everyone within the circle, which is just him, is righteous and not in need. And then he draws a circle around the entire world, around all people, and says, everyone in this circle is in need, And so the difference is not between me and you because of the color of our skin. The difference is whether or not I believe who Jesus says he is, right? And so if the church isn't being mindful of that, how can we be making space for that? So, and isn't that the way forward? And this is what we're continually doing. And next week, we're going to continue this talk here. So 10 o'clock Fridays, join us live on YouTube. And if you miss it, then you know that we repost this over the weekend. We'll take that live. It'll be up throughout the rest of the day. And then it goes down and gets reposted back up on Sunday or Monday. And so we want you to join us. We want you to interact with us, but we also want you to interact with us on a deeper level throughout the course of our lives. And that's through New Wine Skins, the Institute for Cultural Engagement, Christ-centered, spirit-led engagement, so that we can engage at a level that sees the other for who they are, created in the image of God. And we're going to continue this talk. We continue this talk about into the margins. And so we want to continue that as we push into the summer is upon us. June is a very, it should be no different. This month should be a month where we recognize people just like next month, right? We should always be and that's what we want to continue to do. As we continue our talk about stepping into the margins, what does that look like on a day-to-day basis? And this is going to be our continued talk, and we're going to continue this next week. So join us live next week, Friday, 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. If you miss it, just go back onto our YouTube page right here. And if you click subscribe, when we put this video up, as well as we have videos from other aspects of New Wine engagement, New Wine tastings. And then in a few weeks, we start doing a live recording on Facebook called New Wine Table Talks, where we get together a group of people. And it's kind of like our view, the way in which we do engaging from a Christ-centered, spirit-led approach. And so you join us, head on over to New Wine page, a website, new-wineskins.org, where you can sign up for our newsletter and figure out what the ways in which you can participate with the things that we have going on, whether it's through New Wine activities and events or conferences coming up. We have a conference coming up in the fall, and we'll be talking about mental health and things like that. But we want your participation. New Wine's all about participation, because why? This God that we follow is a participatory God, and it's inviting us into a participation with him in the peacefulness and the drawing out of this thing called love. What is love? So on behalf of my friends, Phil and Tony, I'm Matt. This has been New Wine UnCorked. Until next week, we'll see you on the flip side.